The harsh reality of daily life. Imagine waking up not to the soft buzz of an alarm clock, but to the clanging of a church bell or the crowing of a rooster outside your wooden shutter. If you were lucky enough to have shutters at all. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century in Europe, were a time romanticized by films and fairy tales, knights in shining armor, noble ladies in flowing gowns, and feasts in candlelit halls. Yet beneath this glossy veneer lay a world that would shock anyone accustomed to the conveniences of the 21st century. Surviving even a single day in this era required endurance, luck, and an acceptance of discomforts that most modern people would find intolerable. Waking up to a world of dirt and discomfort. Your bed, if you even had one, would not resemble the soft, cushioned haven you know today. The average medieval person slept on a simple wooden frame topped with straw or rushes stuffed into a sack, often shared with family members or even livestock if you lived in a peasant household. These straw-filled mattresses quickly became breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and other vermin. You would itch constantly, and the concept of washing bedding weekly was non-existent. At best, the straw would be replaced once or twice a year, often during festivals or after harvest. Hygiene, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There was no running water. Baths were rare luxuries, sometimes taken only once or twice a year among the lower classes. Water sources, welled streams, rivers were often contaminated with human and animal waste. Washing your face in the morning was more likely done with a rough cloth than with clean water. Your teeth unbrushed, your hair likely crawling with lice. Disease lurked everywhere, from the filth in the streets to the pests in your bedding to the grind of survival. Once awake, your primary focus was not self-fulfillment or leisure but survival. If you were a peasant, which the vast majority of people were, your life revolved around backbreaking agricultural labor. Fields had to be plowed, seeds sown, livestock tended, and firewood collected, regardless of weather conditions. Winter did not grant rest. It merely brought different chores, such as mending tools, preserving food, and trying not to starve. Clothing was functional rather than fashionable for most. Wool-dominated wardrobes, often coarse and uncomfortable against the skin. Shoes, if you had them, were made of simple leather and provided little protection from the elements. In wet or cold conditions, you would be perpetually damp and chilled. There were no waterproof jackets, no insulated boots, and certainly no central heating waiting for you back home. 3. Eating to stay alive. Not to enjoy, forget breakfast cereals, coffee, or a quick trip to the supermarket. The medieval diet was dictated by season, geography, and class. For peasants, this meant a monotonous menu of bread, pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, and occasionally cheese or salted meat if available. Fresh meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions or wealthier households. In winter, when crops failed or stores ran low, hunger was a constant threat. Famine was not a distant fear. It was a cyclical reality. Nobles, while better fed, were not immune to the risks of foodborne illness. Without refrigeration, spoilage was common, and heavy use of spices for those who could afford them was often less about flavor and more about masking the taste of meat that had begun to rot. Ale and wine were consumed in place of water, not for pleasure, but because they were safer to drink. For disease, death, and the ever-present church in the Middle Ages, life was short and often brutal. Infant mortality rates were high, and even reaching adulthood did not guarantee longevity. Plagues, such as the infamous Black Death of the 14th century, could wipe out entire communities. Common illnesses like dysentery, smallpox, and tuberculosis had no cures and could strike anyone, regardless of status. Religion permeated every aspect of life, offering solace, but also imposing rigid structures. The church dictated the calendar, controlling feast days, fasting periods, and moral behavior. While faith provided comfort in an uncertain world, it also fostered fear of sin, of damnation, of the supernatural. Witchcraft, demons, and divine punishment were not mere superstitions. They were accepted explanations for the hardships of daily existence. Violence and insecurity. Modern notions of law enforcement did not exist. If you were wronged, there was little recourse beyond the local lord's justice, which was often biased, brutal, and arbitrary. Bandits roamed the countryside, and wars between feudal lords or kingdoms could erupt with little warning, devastating entire regions. For peasants, this meant crops burned, homes destroyed, and survival made even more precarious. For nobles, life was no less dangerous. While they might enjoy privilege and wealth, they were also prime targets for assassination, intrigue, and violent conflict. A single misstep in court politics could lead to imprisonment or worse. Via the myth of chivalry and the reality of oppression, popular culture often portrays the Middle Ages as an era of gallant knights and noble deeds. In reality, the feudal system entrenched social hierarchies that left little room for mobility. Peasants were bound to the land, obligated to provide labor and taxes to their lords. Women's lives were largely dictated by their fathers or husbands, and opportunities for independence were scarce. The romanticized tournaments and tales of courtly love represented only a tiny fraction of elite society, far removed from the suffering of the common people. Even for knights, the battlefield was not a place of glory but of mud, blood, and brutal hand-to-hand combat. The unyielding chains of medieval society, the Middle Ages, were not simply an age of castles, kings, and romanticized chivalry. They were a tightly bound web of obligation, hierarchy, and unbending tradition that dictated every breath you took. To step into this world is to feel shackled by invisible chains. Society itself was a fortress, and you were born within its walls with little hope of escape. 1. The feudal pyramid. Born at the bottom, staying there forever. Imagine taking your first breath in a thatched roof hut, the air heavy with smoke from the hearth that never properly vents. You are a peasant, the child of peasants, and this single fact will define your life until its end. There is no ladder to climb, no rags to riches story waiting to be written. In the medieval mindset, God himself placed you in this station, and to question it is to question divine will. At the top of the feudal pyramid sits the king, theoretically ordained by God. Beneath him, nobles and lords, who own vast tracts of land. Beneath them are knights, sworn to protect and serve their lords. And at the very bottom, the great, crushing majority are you, the peasantry. Your purpose: to work the land, pay taxes, and ensure the upper layers live in comfort. This hierarchy was not merely an economic system, it was a social and spiritual order. The church reinforced it relentlessly. The Lord protects you, the priest saves you, and you work for them both. Freedom of movement, non-existent. If you fled your Lord's land, you were branded a fugitive and could be dragged back by force. Worse still, your family would bear the punishment for your defiance. 2. The grip of the church. Faith as salvation in shackles. The church was not just a place of worship, it was the beating heart of medieval life, controlling education, morality, politics, and even your calendar. Every event, from birth to death, was steeped in ritual. Baptism, marriage, confession, burial under the church's watchful eye. To deviate was to risk eternal damnation, and in an age where the unknown was terrifying, that threat was paralyzing. You lived in constant fear of sin, not the sins we might think of today, but ones as minor as missing a holy day of obligation, eating meat on a forbidden day, or failing to pay your tithes. Penance, indulgences, pilgrimages. These were not optional acts of devotion but necessities to keep your soul out of hellfire. And the church's influence reached far beyond spiritual matters. It owned vast lands, collected enormous wealth, and could excommunicate kings. For you, this meant living under a dual authority. Your Lord could punish your body, and the church could condemn your soul. 3. Marriage and gender. Contracts, not love stories. If you imagined marrying for love, you'd be sorely disappointed. For peasants, marriage was a practical contract between families, often arranged without your consent. The dowry, money or goods given to secure the union, was more important than your feelings. Love, if it came, was considered a happy accident rather than the foundation of the bond. For women, the situation was even bleaker. A woman's role was to bear children, manage the household, and obey her husband. Legally, she had few rights. Her property, if she had any, often became her husband's upon marriage. Noble women might fare slightly better, managing estates or forging alliances through marriage, but their lives were still controlled by male relatives. In the eyes of the church, sex was primarily for procreation, not pleasure. Priests preached about the dangers of lust, and women were often portrayed as morally weaker, descendants of Eve's original sin. This perception justified their subjugation and left little room for equality. For work and obligation, a life of endless toil from the moment you could walk. You were expected to contribute to the family's survival. For a peasant, this meant dawn to dusk labor in the fields, plowing, sowing, harvesting, tending animals, repairing tools, and paying dues to your lord. These dues weren't just taxes and coin. They included labor services, working the Lord's fields for free, providing goods like grain or livestock, and sometimes even serving in his militia during conflicts. Your life was tied to the rhythms of the land. A bad harvest could mean famine, and famine meant death not just for you but for your entire village. Yet, despite your hard work, you never truly owned the fruits of your labor. The Lord claimed a portion, the church claimed a tithe, and what remained might barely sustain you through winter. 5. Justice, brutal and biased. Justice in the Middle Ages was anything but fair. Laws favored the wealthy and powerful, while peasants were treated as disposable. Trials could involve ordeals meant to let God decide your guilt, walking across hot irons, plunging your hand into boiling water, or being thrown into a river sink and you're innocent, float and you're guilty. Punishments were harsh and public. Theft might earn you mutilation, an ear or hand cut off. Treason or rebellion meant hanging, drawing and quartering, a gruesome spectacle designed to terrify. For lesser crimes, you might be locked in stocks, exposed to public ridicule and abuse. 6. The weight of custom. Change as the enemy. Perhaps the most suffocating chain of all was the medieval resistance to change. Life followed patterns established for generations, the same festivals, the same work routines, the same beliefs. Innovation was slow and often resisted as dangerous or heretical. For a modern mind used to progress in mobility, this unyielding sameness would feel like a prison. To live in the Middle Ages was to accept your place unquestioningly, to bear hardship as God's will, and to find comfort only in the promise of an afterlife. Modern notions of freedom, individuality, or self-determination simply did not exist. You were not a person with potential, you were a role, a function, a piece of a greater order that neither asked for nor allowed your opinion, surviving the daily grind, dirt, disease, and death. Imagine waking at dawn in a one-room hovel, the air so thick with the stench of smoke, sweat, and animals that you gag before you even stand. There is no glass window to open, only a wooden shutter, which lets in a damp chill and a chorus of flies. Outside, the mud from last night's rain clings to every surface. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where dirt is not a condition to clean away, it is a way of life. This was the daily reality for most people in medieval Europe. Contrary to the romanticized images of knights in shining armor and maidens in flowing gowns, life for the overwhelming majority was neither noble nor picturesque. It was a constant struggle against filth, hunger, and disease, in existence defined not by living well but simply by surviving. The tyranny of filth. One of the most shocking aspects of medieval life, from our modern perspective, is the utter omnipresence of dirt. Streets in towns were often little more than open sewers, with refuse, animal droppings, and human waste tossed indiscriminately into the road. Privies, when they existed, were holes in the ground shared by entire households, emptied infrequently and poorly. In larger cities like London or Paris, this lack of sanitation reached horrifying extremes. The stench was legendary. Chroniclers of the time described rivers so choked with waste that fish could not survive, and streets where the mud was so mixed with excrement that carts would sink to their axles. For the average peasant, who spent their days in fields fertilized with human manure, the line between dirt and sustenance blurred uncomfortably. Bathing, too, was a rarity. Although public bathhouses existed in some regions, they were often viewed with suspicion, associated with immorality, or were simply inaccessible to the poor. Soap was a luxury. Instead, people relied on linen undergarments to wick away dirt, a practice that left layers of grime accumulating on the skin. Disease without mercy, this filth was more than unpleasant. It was deadly. The Middle Ages were an era of almost unrelenting sickness. Epidemics swept across the land with grim regularity, their origins often a mystery to those afflicted. The most infamous, of course, was the Black Death of the mid-14th century, which wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. But plague was far from the only threat. Typhoid, dysentery, leprosy, smallpox, and a host of other diseases flourished in the unhygienic conditions. Malaria lingered in marshlands, and tuberculosis festered in crowded dwellings. Even minor injuries could become fatal, as there was no understanding of infection and no reliable treatment. Medical care was rudimentary at best and dangerous at worst. Physicians, often trained in ancient theories of humors, prescribed bloodletting, purging, or the application of bizarre concoctions. Herbal remedies sometimes worked by chance, but superstition often overshadowed science. Charms, prayers, and pilgrimages were common prescriptions for ailments beyond comprehension. Food, hunger, and malnutrition. To survive the filth and disease, one had to eat, but even this was far from guaranteed. For peasants, diet revolved almost entirely around bread pottage, a thin stew of grains and vegetables, and ale. Meat was a luxury, often reserved for festivals or the tables of the wealthy. Malnutrition was a constant companion. Years of poor harvests could devastate entire regions, leading to famine and mass starvation. The Great Famine of 1315–1317 saw countless thousands perish as relentless rains ruined crops and livestock diseases decimated herds. People resorted to eating bark, roots, and even the bodies of the dead in the most desperate circumstances. Even when food was available, it was not always safe. Spoilage was common in the absence of refrigeration, and contamination by parasites or toxins was frequent. Bread might be bulked out with ground-up acorns or even chalk. Ale could be sour or tainted. Yet with no alternatives, people consumed whatever they could find. The relentlessness of labor, as if disease and hunger were not enough. The daily grind of work left little room for rest. From dawn until dusk, peasants toiled in the fields, often performing back-breaking labor with primitive tools. Women worked alongside men, in addition to maintaining the home, raising children, and producing cloth, dairy, or other household goods. For townsfolk, life was scarcely easier. Craftsmen and apprentices labored long hours, often in poorly lit, unventilated workshops. Children, too, were expected to contribute from a young age. Whether by herding animals, assisting in the fields, or learning a trade, work was not merely exhausting, it was dangerous. Accidents in agriculture and craft work were common, and there were no safety nets for those maimed or incapacitated. A broken limb could spell destitution. A bad harvest could mean death. Death is a constant companion. In this world, death was never far away. Infant mortality was staggering. In some regions, half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Mothers risked their lives with every childbirth. Wars, raids, and banditry claimed countless others. Religious belief offered some solace, promising a better existence beyond this life. but it also instilled a deep fear of damnation. The Church's teachings permeated every aspect of existence, from birth to death, and reinforced the idea that suffering was part of God's planetest to be endured rather than a problem to be solved. To live in the Middle Ages was, in many ways, to live with the ever-present shadow of mortality. Survival was a victory, longevity a miracle. The brutality of war, faith, and punishment. If life in the Middle Ages was already harsh with famine, disease, and back-breaking labor, the specter of violence, both divine and earthly, hung over everything like a blackened cloud. War, religion, and justice formed an unholy trinity that ruled over the lives of medieval men and women. To exist in this world was to endure not just poverty and hardship, but a constant threat of bloodshed, persecution, and a justice system that bore little resemblance to mercy. The ceaseless drumbeat of war. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of warring states, feudal lords, and shifting allegiances. Borders were fluid, disputes frequent, and the peasantry always caught in the middle. For a common villager, war was less about knights in shining armor and more about fire, pillage, and starvation. Armies rarely fought on distant fields. They trampled through farmland, burnt crops, stole livestock, and conscripted men at sword point. Take the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. For over a century, England and France dragged each other through a cycle of invasion and retaliation, devastating the countryside. Villages were looted, homes burned, and fields salted. Ordinary people with no stake in royal claims suffered the most, starving as armies stripped their land bare. Even the so-called noble knight was more likely to be a marauder than a protector. Knights were trained killers, often rewarded with the spoils of war. Chivalry, that romantic code later idealized by poets, was in reality an invention of literature, not practice. To the peasant hiding in the forest while his village burned, there was little honor in warfare and warfare. Siege warfare. Starvation as a weapon. Cities and castles, when attacked, rarely fell quickly. Siege warfare was the norm, and it was as cruel as it was effective. Invading armies would surround a fortified town, cutting off all food and water. Inside the walls, civilians faced slow starvation. Parents watched their children waste away. Disease ran rampant as sanitation collapsed. Sometimes, desperate defenders resorted to horrific measures. Accounts from various sieges describe eating rats, dogs, and even the dead. To surrender was no guarantee of safety. Victors often massacred populations to serve as an example to others. Faith, comfort, and oppression. Religion was both solace and a yoke. The Church was everywhere, in every village, in every moment of life from birth to death. Faith could provide meaning to suffering, but it also justified that suffering. Sin explained famine, disease, and disaster. If your harvest failed, perhaps God was punishing you. Priests preached obedience to both God and your earthly lord. The hierarchy was clear: God above, king below him, and you, a mere soul whose salvation depended on submission. The Church wielded immense power, political, economic, and spiritual. It owned vast tracts of land, collected tithes, mandatory taxes, and could excommunicate rulers. Dissent was not tolerated. Heretics, those who questioned church doctrine, were branded enemies of both faith and state. Punishment ranged from imprisonment to execution, often by fire. The Inquisition exemplified this ruthless enforcement, rooting out suspected heretics with torture and public trials. For the average person, religion was unavoidable. Feast days and rituals structured the year, and fear of eternal damnation loomed large. Heaven was a distant hope. Hell was a vivid certainty, painted in lurid detail on church walls to keep the flock in line. Justice without mercy. The medieval justice system was a theater of brutality. Trials often had little to do with evidence and much to do with social standing. The rich could buy leniency. The poor suffered full force. Torture was a legitimate method of extracting confessions, with devices like the rack, which dislocated limbs, the thumbscrew, and the iron boot. Punishments were public spectacles designed not only to penalize but to deter. Executions drew crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings at the stake, and even more gruesome fates like drawing and quartering were celebrated events. For lesser crimes, you might be whipped, branded, mutilated, or placed in the stocks to be pelted by townsfolk. Justice could also be determined by trial, by ordeal, where divine judgment supposedly revealed innocence or guilt. You might be forced to grasp a red-hot iron bar or be plunged into a river with your hands bound. If you emerged unscathed or survived long enough afterward, you were deemed innocent. Otherwise, God had judged you guilty. The scourge of crusades and holy war. Perhaps the most infamous blend of war and faith were the Crusades. Beginning in the late 11th century, these holy wars aimed to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control, but quickly expanded into campaigns of conquest, looting, and slaughter. Crusaders massacred entire cities, including Christian populations, under the banner of God. For those left behind in Europe, crusades meant new taxes, conscription, and sometimes returning veterans who brought tales and disease.